It's one of our staple feedbacks for most animations because poses are the backbone, the bread and butter, the back butter of that. Probably shouldn't say that word. Hey, want to be reviewed? Just send your animations in the Professor Goo review channel in the Discord. Each stream I'll be going over one animation, which will be randomly selected from that channel. If you happen to be in stream that day, we'll go over it and maybe even jump into a call. If you want to watch these streams live, go to twitch.tv/DylanGoo. Hey Goos, welcome to Professor Goo Reviews. We are going over Psy's animation today, which is actually this RWBY fan animation. Apparently Psy made the models themselves, which is just like, I can't even believe it. I mean, when I was working on RWBY, these models looked pretty much the same as the models we were using on the show. So we're gonna go over this a little bit, talk about three things here. Is gonna be clipping, pose pushing, and props. So clipping is specifically talking about whenever objects clip through each other. If you don't know what clipping is, basically it's when 3D objects intersect when they shouldn't be, because in real life 3D objects can't intersect, right? They actually collide and like bounce off each other. So that's clipping. We're going to talk about exactly how to avoid it or when to avoid it, and sometimes it's unavoidable and it's worth keeping. It just depends. We're going to talk about the philosophy of clipping and how we can improve the clipping here. And then we also have pose pushing. Just pushing poses to make them look better. It's one of our staple feedbacks for most animations because poses are the backbone, the bread and butter, the back butter of that. Probably shouldn't say that word. Anyway, we have pose pushing. We're gonna do that. We're gonna push poses. That's all. Anyway, props. We're gonna do props now. Okay, so props. So the topic of props is actually really cool because we have a lot of props in this particular animation, specifically. Which would, in theory, affect how things animate. So you're gonna want to take into consideration all the weight and all the different ways you handle it and all the ways it could affect the center of balance. So we're gonna talk about exactly how we animate props effectively without making them feel too basically weightless, right? So you don't ever want to just like parent something to the hand and just move it around as if it's got nothing in it. So cool. We're gonna talk about that a little bit. All right. So those are our three things. And yeah. Well, I guess we'll get into it. First thing we're going to talk about clipping. Clipping is, again, a big topic of discussion. We're going to think about, well, how many times do things clip in this animation, right? I mean, it's a fair amount, right? We have clipping in a lot of things. We honestly clip things every now and then too. It's not like a super easy thing to avoid. You know what I mean? Like in 3D, like when these things happen, you either notice them and they're there, or you don't notice them and they just stay in. And it's just how it is. And it's like, we can talk about whether or not clipping is okay in certain scenarios. And whether or not it's avoidable and you should avoid it, you know, those kinds of things. So one of the pieces of clipping that we just saw is an example of like, oh, that's something that honestly nobody's really seeing and it's kind of fine. It's kind of okay. But if you wanted to avoid the clipping, then all you would have to do technically is just move the hand here, right? And like then it would sort of fit within that crevice. And like if you can avoid that, then that'd be ideal, I think, right? A very small thing. But the one piece of clipping that I would definitely recommend fixing up is the one that we see basically at the climax of this short. No clipping on the shield, which is great, by the way. But then we see, oh wait, hang on. Wait a minute. No clipping on the shield, sigh. The part I wanted to talk about was actually this. So this is an interesting clipping situation where you actually do want to clip the mesh because it's stabbing into something, right? When you stab into stuff, that's the one time in real life that objects clip, right? Technically. So the clipping here, I think the way that it works, if you want to get a stabby mechanism to really feel good, the clipping in this particular case should be done a little differently and where you want to emphasize it. So if you want to emphasize the clipping and you want it to stab properly, I would actually recommend getting a vertex parent down. In fact, what you could do in a very simple way is you could basically have the vertex parent, you know, where it's supposed to be, which is like right around here. I'm just tracking this with my eye right now. Is you could have an empty parented to the vertex here. You can damp track, constraint the sword to that empty. But you can see it's supposed to really just keep pointing in that particular direction. If you can get it to stick onto the actual mesh that you're stabbing into, it'll feel a lot more realistic, right? Because that's what real stabby stabs do, right? Real stabby stabs stab into the thing and they stay stabbed, right? They stay stabbed. That's important. And they don't slide around and cut and do all these other things. So what you're going to do is you're going to have the knife in there, boom, keep it in, don't let them bleed out. So yeah. And that's mostly it for clipping, I think. And that brings us to the props segment, which is actually the third segment, but we'll do it now anyway. So basically, for the prop stuff, I think a couple examples where we look at props and we see the props are in people's hands and we kind of get an idea that they're holding them, but we don't really feel like they're holding them, right? So right here, you can see that the sword is like, you know, it's being animated, but it's not being quite animated to the point where it feels heavy, right? Now, I think right here, a couple things about rapiers and about swords in general is that technically speaking, when you hold props, you want to try to hold them in a way that feels the most balanced. One thing is actually holding closer to the hilt is better for center of mass. The lower the center of balance is, closer to the hilt, then the more nimble a sword can be, the faster it can move, right? The more you can, the quicker you can outcompete your opponent, right? So for rapiers and fencing, especially when speed's all about it, it's like you're gonna have as low of a center of mass as possible, which really helps with Weiss's like whole gun barrel thing. But like the other thing about that is like if you hold the sword near the hilt or the end of the hilt, that center of balance is wasted, right? Because the pivot is still far away from your from the hand, basically, right? So one thing is like sort of where you want to hold the prop, right? Typically you want to hold it near the center of mass if you can. Right here, we're going to talk about this particular animation here. One thing technically when it comes to this prop in particular, because it is a rapier, rapiers are pointy points, right? Rapiers are pointy points. They point and that's about it. So one thing I would say is probably don't slash. They're really, really bad at slashing. They're okay. Like they can scrape and that's about it. All right. Only the points actually have any damage. So I would say this particular stabby motion should probably be more of a different pose. Let's talk about pose pushing for this. How do we get the pose to actually feel good, specifically for this stabby motion? Well, this is actually a really, really good pose setup. This right here, Sai, you've done a great job setting this up. A really, really good job. All right. Now check this out. You have a really good opportunity to do a stab motion, right? You could do a stab motion like this, like, hiya, boom, flows perfectly into it from one pose to another, boom, pshink, pshink, pshink. But then you wind it back this way, and that makes it much harder to do a stabby motion. So what I would actually prefer is that instead of that, you could easily have this stabby motion here to prepare for basically the wind up and all that stuff. So stuff like that. Once you get this pose in, you have a really good pose for, yeah, this basically the same pose, but now you can go more into this. Now we can talk about the wrist as well. I think the wrist itself is another thing. It's a small thing, but I'll talk about it later. So we have this stabby motion, and this feels, as you can see, a lot more stabby, right? Boom, boom, boom. Stab, 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 stab. I think this pose is the most interesting because from an acting perspective, we get a lot from, a lot of opportunity here to get Weiss to show some emotion, show some whatever it is. And I think these poses here are they're a little neutral, they're a little basic. I think we could lean into it a bit more. I don't know exactly the emotion she's feeling here, but I think it's sort of like this, I don't know, considered like this considerable hesitancy. Like she kind of wants to, like, she's like not sure if she's strong enough, or she's like, oh my God, I gotta fight, or like whatever it is, right? So just a little bit of hesitance. And I think if you wanted to have something that feels like hesitant, I would actually prefer if she didn't look at her sword like this, right, with a simple lifting up of the wrist, but rather looking at her hand as a whole. So I think a better pose would actually be something like this, right? So you have a raised elbow, a bent elbow, a raised hand. She would have a more clear sort of like, I don't know, visual on her hand and like what she's about to do. And I think that would make her feel a little bit more hesitant, right? Yeah. And I think that'll be good. And yeah, we'll finish up the review there. This was really good. Overall, models are fantastic. Effects are fantastic. There's a couple things we can push with poses and clipping, and of course with the props. But yeah. Hope it helped.